of emergency management, including as you will hear also in this session talking about humanitarian emergencies, which is not something again that we thought of from a federalism perspective, transport and migration, all of that. But of course, Anna will be speaking later today. This is something that has had a profound impact in countries like Brazil over the last few years. So I look forward very much to this interaction. Greta, thank you very much for pulling it all together so nicely as always. And as you pointed out, it's been a year since we last did this, but time flies so fast. I'm really looking forward to listening to Dr. Dhar Chakrabarti, Anna, Carolina, and Nico Steitler. And I look forward to the discussions. With this, I hand over to my colleague, George Stairs, who I understand will moderate the discussion. Over to you, George.
Thank you very much, Rupa. So just to set up the panel discussion, as we've discussed previously, we were looking at three very different examples of public emergencies and challenges faced by multi-level systems. Our initial concept that we kind of teased in sort of the discussion was, looking at whether federal and decentralized systems are better able to handle these sorts of challenges has, as discussed previously, been examined thoroughly for the past, many, many years. So it might be a bit presumptuous to decide whether or not we will come down, with a definitive answer today. Just a note on the structure and how we will proceed. Each presenter will have 10 to 12 minutes to speak to their specific issue area. And once we have heard from all three presenters, we will move into a moderated discussion for about 20 minutes or thereabouts. And this will be followed by a student's question and answers, for which we would ask that you use the question and answer function in the Zoom call. With that being said, we'll proceed in alphabetical order. So I'd like to begin by introducing our first presenter, Dr. Dhar Chakrabarti. Dr. Dhar Chakrabarti is a retired civil servant who held important assignments in both federal and provincial governments of the Republic of India. This included the position of Secretary of the Interstate Council, an important IGR body of India. Earlier, Dr. Chakrabarti had headed India's National Institute of Disaster Management as its executive director and National Disaster Management Authority as its secretary. Post-superannuation from the civil service, Dr. Chakrabarti has continued to work and write in the field of federalism and environmental concerns, as well as disaster management. Presently, Dr. Chakrabarti is the Swami Vivekananda Chair, Professor, and Head of the School of Environment and Disaster Management at the Ramakrishna Mission, Vivekananda University, Bilur, India. So without further ado, Dr. Chakrabarti, thank you. Doctor, you're still muted, I'm afraid. There we go.
Thank you, George, for your introduction and this and for the invitation for this round table. We are discussing emergency situation, and emergency situations are created mainly by disasters, and there may be so many other kinds of emergencies also. And the nature of emergencies today, these are changing. These are becoming extremely complex and interconnected. So the climate change is adding another dimensions to the nature of these emergencies, with the more frequent and more intense kind of disasters, particularly the hydrometeorological disasters, which are affecting countries. And the past is no longer the guide for the future, because that we are living in a very, very uncertain kind of future. So now the second aspect of the risk is that the emergency is that it is getting increasingly globalized. What used to be, decades past, the kind of a localized emergencies with the local government or the provincial governments had the resources and the capacity to deal with those. Now these are becoming so complex and so interconnected in the globalized world through supply chain management system, that it is no longer confined within a local region. So it is becoming very global. So the local governments have to look forward to the assistance from the central government for effectively dealing with the situation. Now, another aspect of the risk is that, and the present pandemics also brought it so clearly, that the risks are becoming very systemic in nature. That means a risk in a particular field, it is not confined to within that field, but it has impact on so many other areas. The most important example is the pandemic that we are going through. It's a biological risk concerning the health sector, but we have seen that how it has impacted on several aspects of the economy, agriculture, industry, and tourism, transport, and so on. So it has become a concern where what we call these days that an approach which is a whole of government approach, that it is not the emergency management is no longer the concern for the emergency managers, but it is for the concern for the government as a whole. And these are going to be increasingly so. And we find that the very concept of the risk management, it is also undergoing changes. Because earlier we are looking at emergency management as a kind of a managing an event of emergency. It is a kind of an event management system. So we had a lot of management techniques like incident command system and others to look at it, to deal with the emergency. But now the concept is there is a paradigm shift, that you not merely look at the post-emergency situations, but you have to look ab initio into the whole process of the risk management, how the risks are created in the first instance, and how we can prevent creation of the risks, and how do you mitigate the risks. And once you are mitigated, then what do you do with the residual risk, and how do you transfer the risks to the various kind of risk pooling or risk insurance system? And the residual risk that you are left with, and how do you are prepared to face that risk, through an early warning system, through capacity building exercises, and through various other ways, by developing capacity for, the medical preparedness, your humanitarian assistance preparedness, the stockpiling of essential goods and services, and your mechanism for restoration of the services, and so on. So it is increasingly becoming very, very complicated, and also very, very professional in nature. Risk management is a now highly professional subject. So we find in the federal countries, and the federal countries, they are generally very large, but we have also federal countries which are very, very small. And we have federal countries where many sovereign states join together to create a federation, like, joining together federation, the classical federation of the United States, Canada, or Australia. Or we have, federation itself creating these states like the Indian Union, where what we call as the holding together federation. So whatever the system it is, and everywhere the pattern and the trend is the same. And that is that even the provincial governments and the local governments, they feel that it is not possible for them to deal with the risk, to manage the risks at the local level, because the risk is so globalized and so interconnected and so complex and so systemic, that it requires assistance of the national governments, and in the case of developing world, also require the assistance of the international community. So you see a pattern of trend happening, starting with the Stafford-Cripps Act in the USA, where that act was passed by the American Congress, and then and the state, there was not much of objections from the state governments. Rather, the states had welcomed it. And similarly, in the Indian Constitution, you find that the Disaster Management Act was passed in 2005, and there was no provision for that in the Constitution, because it was that subject of emergency management didn't figure anywhere in the Constitution. So they used the concurrent subject of social insurance for the central government to pass that legislations, which was essentially the state governments to deal with. And there was no fundamental objections from the state government. When we find the similar things in Australian government, where the states are so concerned about their own rights, but even there, states, basically they agree to a kind of an arrangement, either not, if it is not legislative arrangement, at least some kind of an administrative and financial arrangements, by which they are looking forward to the central government for for assistance, for technical assistance as well as financial assistance. Now, this technical assistance, this is also, or technological assistance, it is becoming very, very important in risk management these days, because new levels or new types of technology are developing, and where the assessment of the risk itself, it cannot be done locally, because it has to be done locally. Locally, we can be part of the process, but the risks are so interconnected that you need, some kind of assistance for the central level, scientific, technical, and other organizations, the satellite-based other organizations, for developing the early warning of disasters, and where the states in the federating system, they are all benefited by that. So that technology is playing many important role, and the financial resources also is playing another important role, because the states are increasingly looking forward for assistance, because their local resources are not adequate enough for deal with this kind of increasingly complex disasters. So I find this is one area where the central government is increasingly, and the federal government in most of the federal countries, these are playing increasingly important role in the managing emergency situations, and there are not much of conflict or tension with the state governments in doing so. Now, another aspect, if you look at it, the other aspect, that is that when you say that, you manage disasters, basically disasters have to be managed locally. There is a proverb in our, that, think globally and act locally. So you think nationally or think globally, but act locally, because every disaster fundamentally, it affects the community at the local level. So you have to manage the disasters at the local level. So that involves not only the capacity development at the local level, but also decentralization of powers and authorities, powers for taking decisions at the local level. And there have been significant initiatives in various parts of in various federal countries, and as well as other countries, for developing the local communities at the local level, at the local government, community-based disaster risk management, and then you have the state governments, power through the different kind of mechanisms have been developed by which we empower the state governments to manage these disasters locally. So these are some of my initial comments to begin with, and subsequently I would be reacting to it as and when the discussion proceeds. Is it okay, George, or you have some more time to discuss?
You have about 2 or 3 minutes left if you want, but if you're happy to finish there, Doctor.
Yeah, I think I close for the time being and then waiting for my turn to speak again. Thank you.
All right, very good. Thank you very much. All right, thank you very much for those comments, Dr. Chakrabarty. We will now proceed to hear from Ms. Ana Carolina Lorena. Ms. Lorena is the Senior Advisor for Investor Relations at the Caixa Econômica Federal, a state-owned bank in Brazil, and she was formerly head of international affairs at the Undersecretariat for Federative Affairs of the Presidency of the Republic of Brazil, working in the area of decentralized cooperation and institutional relations. Ms. Lorena has been with the Brazilian Public Service since 2004, performing a number of senior roles. Besides that, she represented Brazil in the Forma Federation's board of directors for 2 mandates and is also the first female elected fellow of the forum. So without further ceremony, Anna, if you would like to begin.
Hello, George. Hello. Good morning, Dr. Dar, Nico, Steitler, and also Rupak, and all the audience that's listening to us this morning. So I was invited to talk about a specific topic, that is crisis on migration in federal countries, especially here in Brazil, to bring a case that is pretty new and a little bit out of the same dynamics that you have in Europe, with heavier flows of immigrants. But what we may try to discuss today and give a glance of is about how to manage such crises in federal countries, and if this system of government would help or not to solve these questions, and how this impact on each level of federation, and how it brings complexity to the system. So I believe that the challenge today, federations can, what can I say, respond to current challenges in a most complex way than unitary countries, and it brings a lot of complexity into things. To understand and to see dynamics of competition and cooperation in federations can explain a little bit, but not all aspects of being a federation. So today we will speak a little bit of a federal government initiative that's called Operação Acolhida, or the United Nations call it Welcome Operation. And it's designed to welcome and interiorize immigrants from Venezuela. Since 2015, we have a growing flow of these migrants, especially in the beginning was pretty much economic migrants, and today we have even political. And Venezuelans were declared refugees within the Brazilian framework in 2018. So today they are given the status of refugees if they claim for that. And so we have some numbers. According to the United Nations, approximately 5.7 million people fled Venezuela. This number is as of June last year, June 2021, and 85%, approximately 4.6 million, have moved to another country within Latin America and the Caribbean. So Colombia hosts the largest number of Venezuelans with more than 1.7 million entries. Colombia also has responded and implemented a policy providing displaced Venezuelans with a temporary protection status for the next 10 years. So they are not pretty much declared refugee for lifetime, but they have a status for 10 years. Peru also had more than 1 million immigrants, Chile almost 500,000, 460, Ecuador 360, and in Brazil we had 610,000 entries, but only 260,000 requests of refugee status. So it's pretty much we can rely on cultural matters that would put those people away, especially that 20% turn back on the border. They just arrive into Pacaraima, and then they decide to go back or flee to Peru or Colombia, for instance, especially because of the language barrier and the cultural barrier. So those that stays, even if they do not file for refugee status, they can have a couple of civil rights, such as basic income. But if they file for refugee status, they will have all civil rights right away, such as work permit, access to public health, education, and social support with this basic income. And some of them decide to have no status at all, or maybe to migrate around. But the Acolhida operation offers shelter for the newcomers. It's not like a refugee camp. They are free to go anytime. So that's quite human. And they are offered a number of things. So they have voluntary shelter and food. they register all the newcomers. They file for free for the status if they are desired. They have all the mandatory vaccinations done, medical and dental treatment. And also what's the most, how to say, better outcome of the situations is that they have voluntary relocations. So from now, as of December, we had more than 67,000 relocations. So government and partners, they even fund air tickets or bus tickets. And it's a partnership with municipalities. So they subscribe for the program. Sometimes they have shelter houses for them as well. And so they agree to receive those migrants and to offer support as school and public health and all the Portuguese classes and all the transitions that is desired. So, you know, it's such a nice and cute operation because it aggregates like NGOs, the United Nations, a number of other partners, even air carriers that offers tickets. And it brings to us like a good sense of nationalism and what is being welcome all these people, especially because most of them are pretty much economic migrants. Of course, we recognize them as refugees, but they're not like, most of them are not politicians fleeing. They're just people that being displaced by dictatorship, actually. So I hope it can answer or to contribute with the debate, as we have like in the 20 years, the percentage of the global population that is considered as migrants, displaced, and refugees grew 1.1%. Like 20 years ago, 2.6%, if I'm not mistaken, were considered international migrants. And today we are looking to something at 3.8% of the world's population, and pretty much most of them are economic migrants. But there's still a lot of new wars and displacement. So of course that reality around the globe is tricky, and we can see that pretty much more challenging to some other nations as North America and in Europe, but bringing in a view that even a middle income country or some developing nations can do something that's kind of more human and welcoming, just make me think that we are going in the right direction. Thank you very much. I'm open to talks, and we can give any perspective in the future. I thank you.
Thank you very much, Anna, for your presentation. And that'll bring us to our third presenter today, Professor Nico Steitler. Professor Steitler is the South African Research Chair in Multilevel Government, Law and Development at the Dullah Omar Institute of Constitutional Law, Governance and Human Rights of the University of the Western Cape. He has authored and edited, and continues to write and edit, a number of publications on multi-level government and local government in South Africa, other countries around the region and globally, as well as a number of other sort of ongoing publications. So his past work has included as editor of Concurrent Powers in Federal Systems, Meaning Making and Managing, and Local Government and Metropolitan Regions in Federal Systems, as well as working on an upcoming publication, the Forum of Federation's Handbook on Local Government and Federal Systems, just a sort of shameless plug there, if you don't mind. He has acted as a constitutional advisor on federalism in Yemen, the Solomon Islands, Trinidad and Tobago, South Sudan, Somalia, and Ethiopia. So thank you very much, Professor, for coming here, and I'll give you the floor.
Thank you, George. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
And you can see me.
Yes.
Okay, although the one little block still says muted. Right, it's a very challenging question that you've posed at the beginning. Are federal systems better able to adapt and address large-scale national challenges better than unitary states through more regional, local knowledge and adaptability? Now, this is a tough question, and it's a question often asked by people in federations when they see a mess. They ask, will we be better off in a central, a unitary state? It's also asked by officials and politicians. And as you already suggested, there may not be a clear answer, and my answer is a yes, but answer. Now, the point would be is that these national crises or challenges are by their very nature of a national level. But they also are, and as Dr. Chakraborty was saying, they always have a local presence. So the question was then, in say, taking just COVID pandemic as a real example, how could a nation respond to that? Unitary state, one decision-making body, quick, decisive action. When you come to federations, then suddenly we see that the tools of reaction, the tools of dealing with the pandemic are split between the federal government and subnational governments. Health, disaster management, a whole range of these functions are shared. And I think the reality in most federations is that there has been a concurrency of powers, despite the fact that there are still notions of dual federalism, where there are neat, attempted watertight divisions between the powers of a federal government and subnational governments. And so the question is, how does a federal government then deals with it? And it's, again, it's under stress. It's particularly with the pandemic, it must quick, decisive, and comprehensive action. And so there usually have two options. The one option is for the federation to become a de facto unitary state. And this is done by the usurpation, centralization of powers of the subnational powers. It's like they use with a decree, like a tomahawk. You cut the constitutional lines, rules that allocate powers, and you usurp, and then you take decisive action. The second option is for the federation to act, and the federal government and the subnational governments to act jointly as if they are a unitary state. So the emphasis goes on to strong intergovernmental relations and cooperative government, agreements, unity of purpose, collaboration, clear one voice, one action, uniformity. And the result is, in a sense, what I say, a unitary state. And the opposite is then true if that does not happen. When the federal government and subnational government do not act as a unitary state, there's conflict, no cooperation, no coordination, and there are many examples where disaster results in federal countries. We can only think, and sorry to refer to Brazil, but that is the one case, US, Argentina, and a number of others, where that disunity resulted in high loss of life. And it is the comorbidity of a lack of cooperation that results in that. So Federations, I would argue, is not per se better for quick and concerted efforts. Unitary states there could act quicker, but the problem is that often they do not act at all or very slow. The other advantage that federations have then against over unitary states is in the case where the federal government, for example, in the US and Brazil, did not act, but that your subnational governments, the states and local governments in the respective countries could take the initiative, could institute measures to deal with COVID. And so federations have the advantage then over unitary states by having this inbuilt check and balance. One can just imagine what these the US and Brazil would have been if they were unitary countries under the presidencies of Trump and Bolsonaro. The further advantage, obviously, that decentralized systems, federations would have is that you could then be much more differentiated in your activities, in your measures taken, so that it is proportionate to the threat at a particular point in time by, say, the pandemic. One also sees then on the other side of unitary governments, where they see that their one-size-fits-all, the unitary nature of their measures would lead to disproportionate results, and therefore was also devolving some of their powers, whether to prefect or to mayors, in order to minimize the disproportionality of uniform national measures. So that is at a national level. But as I said, pandemics are also big regional issues. They must be dealt with in terms of the region's own competences on health, on disaster management, on education, and the likes. But because it's also a regional problem, you see the differentiations coming in, whether it's urban, rural. Clearly, very important in terms of transmissibility of a virus. Also, age versus the old versus the young, where the one is much more vulnerable to the COVID virus than the other. So there are then regional differentiations and particularities that calls for different actions. And here the argument is then subnational governments here are better at first detecting and acting against a pandemic because they experience it firsthand long before the federal government will realize this is a national problem. And this is also the case, the advantage over a unitary state, which will have to see how this problem of a health endemic becomes a pandemic. But local knowledge and experience is also a two-edged sword. On the one hand, local authorities would realize this is a problem, there's a health crisis, we must do something. But at the same time, they also see if we take measures, it is going to hurt the local economy. And with this COVID pandemic, there are numerous examples where the choice was against taking action by issuing health measures, but trying to almost ignore it for the sake of keeping the economy going. In the famous case, Inschel is a ski resort in Austria, where they knew this is the place where the virus in February 2020 was spreading across the world, yet they didn't want to close the ski resort, the village, because it was the mainstay of the village economy. So these dual ways, two sides of the sword that both can be beneficial and need not be so. So it's a very difficult choice for subnational governments to make, and that becomes a limitation often of a decentralized system, where the national government, federal government, must then step in and say, yes, we're going to override local interest, local economic interest in the sake of a broader picture of health measures. By the same token, they would say, we realize certain of our measures may be disproportionate. We will nevertheless provide discretion or again devolve powers to subnational governments, restore those powers and say, you make decisions based on local knowledge. And in this case, you see regions also become innovators, experimenters about how best to deal with a crisis, with a serious pandemic. And it's like, the subnational governments being like a glowworm, a luminous worm, which when things really get dark, they glow and you see them. So in the darkness of the height of the pandemic, subnational governments came to the fore, came with initiatives, even small things like how best to establish and erect a mobile hospital, a field hospital to deal with patients. So there's that example that which doesn't exist in unitary states, that they can, in fact, shine a light, glow in the dark as examples of how things could be done better. But I think the fundamental issues still with federations would be, how do you deal with it, with a pandemic, and I think all the other crises that I mentioned are national crises, but felt at the local level? How do you do it in a measured way so that you do not lose the possibilities of local innovation, local differentiation, yet at the same time, not to be delivered to the parochial interest of the locals, which act in a sense against the national interest by only tending their garden as opposed to looking at the bigger picture. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that, Nico. So we will now move on to the moderated discussion section of the roundtable discussion. And so I'll begin by posing a question to each of the panelists broadly about their subject matter, and they'll have an opportunity to reply to that, and then we can open it up to the other panelists if they wish to jump in. So we'll go in reverse order, and Professor Steitler, while you're fresh, I guess I first wanted to address specifically with regards to the COVID-19 pandemic. We've seen in a number of countries more of a centralization of powers with the federal or national government. And you spoke about governments taking more direct action and acting as unitary states with or without the cooperation of the states or the provinces. So for those countries where that applies, I guess, and this is sort of a Cassandra question, do you think post-pandemic we will see a reversion of those powers that the central or federal government has assumed? Will we see those revert back to the provinces or states in some cases? Or is this another case where once the central government has assumed those powers, that's it?
I think probably there's two answers to it. The one is the assumption of powers, the centralization was usually done with a decree coming from the federal government, which then usurps the powers. These had sunset clauses that had to be renewed regularly. And so legally, constitutionally, there should be a reversal of the centralization, so it should go back. The more larger question is, did it in fact create the political atmosphere for that matters were dealt better? And here the jury is out. In a number of countries, the subnational governments actually did better than the federal government. Or one example would be the United Kingdom, where Scotland, and it's fairly unanimous of opinion, is that the Scottish government actually came out shining. Nicola Sturgeon, the First Minister, was in fact enhanced the status of saying where Scotland dealt with the matter fairly well, and people will see much better than Boris Johnson, although that's not very difficult to do. So there is even in a number of places where the subnational governments enhance their status by the actions that they took. And so it's not an inevitableness that it should be the matter should be remain centralized. And it's also now a clawback time for provinces and states. Let's resume our past functions. It's no longer a crisis. The pandemic is now in a very transitionally out-phasing phase, and we're going to assert again as matters as usual. The question would be, is in fact, could they have advanced their position? So that's also an argument that may come forward, that the federal subnational units may advance their position through this by saying this is a matter that should belong to us, and we can cope with serious problems.
Thank you. Ms. Lorena or Dr. Chakrabarti, did either of you wish to speak to that topic before we move ahead?
Yeah,
Dr.
now in the
Chakrabarti?
context of the discussion on corona, I would like to
Dr. Chakrabarti?
Hello.
Hello,
Yes.
we can hear you. We just
Yes.
cannot
So in
see.
the context of the discussion on corona, I would like to just bring to your notice very interesting thing that happened in India. For example, in India, when there was a nationwide lockdown was announced by our Prime Minister, with just 4 hours notice, central government took such an unusual emergency power, and that emergency power is not even provided under the Constitution of India. The entire nation was shut down in just 4 hours notice. And then what followed, as you have seen it, from the metropolitan cities, informal workers from the villages, they started migrating, and there was no communication. Everything was shut down. And you have seen people walking hundreds and thousands of kilometers to reach their destination. So that was an example of extreme central control without any consultation with the state government. And the central government learned during that time, because every time they were trying to manage it, they found it so difficult to manage. And because the central government was issuing all restrictions from the Ministry of Home Affairs on a day-to-day basis, how did we manage? And it became unmanageable. Then we find that in the second phase of this pandemic, when it really became a very bad situation in India, then the central government decided to decentralize and give it to the responsibility of the state government. In the second phase, we find that the central government was not controlling anything, and they left everything for the state governments to decide. And to the extent that when the vaccination came, the central government took the decision that it is for the states to lay down their policy for how they will vaccinate the people, whether they will be subsidizing it or making it a free or they'll be charging it for that. And at that point of time, it is the state governments who are unanimous in that decision. In fact, they approached the Supreme Court of India also. They say that it is basically the responsibility of the central government, to make this vaccination free of cost to all its citizens. But the central government was very reluctant to do it, but they did it ultimately. Then you see that central control initially, then central not being able to manage it and leaving to states to do it. States, found it very difficult to manage it without the assistance of the central government. And finally, unanimously deciding that it is the central government's responsibility to make these vaccinations available in adequate quantity and also free of cost for its citizens. Very interesting dynamics, how the center-state relations evolved in that particular crisis situation in India. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Doctor. Anna, did you want to speak to any of that?
Okay, sure. We always have a contribution. I believe, like, even in the context that when you don't have cooperation, when you have cooperation better, but sometimes in a context where you don't have cooperation like we had, dispute can bring positive outcomes in the end. The dynamics of dispute sometimes brings each entity to put up its best effort. So it's what, like Professor Nico said, you have checks and balance, but not also to straightforward into a formal response to punish the entity that is not doing well, or the entity that is not cooperating, or the entity that is making the mess of the situation. So like here we had these dynamics of dispute in benefit of the population during the COVID crisis, of course. We had many losses, but the competition in between the federal government and some states brought it up to everyone to fiercely put their point into dispute. So when it came out, the ruling of the Supreme Court, it became more clear into our new federation. We have a new constitution that is from 1988. So when the Supreme Court clarified powers and competences of each one, each entity, each level of administration, it became clear who and how they would play the game. And how each one could contribute. Of course, there was like attempts to hint here and there, but the competition to have the first vaccinations, to have more vaccines, to advance with everything, it came out to more positive than negative. Maybe if they collaborate, if you have a fabricate collaboration, maybe the outcome would be even worse. Of course, we don't want to advocate any sides of that. The same happens with environment and other aspects, even with immigration. It goes, it's a, how to say, cross issues question on cooperation and competition in federal countries. I hope I contribute somehow.
No, absolutely, Anna. Thank you for your points. So, I guess while listening to the three responses to that initial question and the subject of subnational units and the innovation or competition that they can sort of offer in dealing specifically with the COVID-19 pandemic, but in other areas that we've discussed here, I guess the question that came to mind just out of the discussion now was looking at sort of subnational or the state provincial governments as, you know, the classic line about them as laboratories of innovation and you know, policy innovation in addressing these emergencies. And of course, the current pandemic is a you know, worldwide case study in this. But the question, and we have seen areas where subnational governments have addressed the pandemic, you know, much better than their contemporaries. So my question was, in those cases where that occurred, and you may each be able to speak to your specific national area or national expertise, in areas where that innovation or subnational units handled the pandemic better, what were those measures then adopted by other subnational units in the same country, I guess is sort of the question. Is that clear to anybody? Anna, you can reply first if you would like, or if you're not prepared, then I'll open it up to either Dr. Chakrabarti. Okay.
Don't worry. Just because I just spoke, but anyway, you were telling like a subnational as laboratory of innovations. It makes a lot of sense. Of course, everyone dealing with challenges for the first time gets a little bit, how to say, confusing on the coordination of things, especially in new federations. Like, we are not a new federation, but we have constitution from 1988 that it was the constitution of a developing country, such like Nepal today, that we had the federation in the constitution, the federation we want to have, not the one we had at the moment, because we were like living a decade-long period of dictatorship. So what we see by that moment, that we made a strong local level that would be the layer closer to the citizen, but at the same time, we don't have the income to fund local level governments. What happens, like local level, they survive on property tax, they survive on service tax and other tax that depends on how rich you are. You know, if people don't have houses, they don't pay like how to say, property tax if they do not consume service that it's more sophisticated than goods itself. We don't have revenues on the local level, so it comes on a cycle that we have to bring some development at the local level. When you see a lab of innovation, especially here during the COVID times, we had a very special participation of the level of the state level. So the state level always claimed that to be the level that was forgotten in the 1988 Constitution, but it has a lot to do with economic development. So that's why they were so important during the COVID crisis, due to the shutdown. So they have the power to shut down, especially industries and all the economic factors that would affect the pandemic. And they also run the middle complexity and the high complexity hospitals. So all the pressure was on them, like on ICUs. So they became how to say, motors of the response to the COVID and innovation. They were the first state. It was a state government to first use a vaccine, to have a partnership to produce a vaccine. Was an state that had the first technology to do the whole process of the vaccine. So I think I had if they let me answer, we had a question about Maria Teresa, about the state role into the Acolhida operation. It's also they hold like much of middle and high education. They're the one that are offering Portuguese classes. They're the one that enrolling their children into high school or whatever. They answer mostly for the medium and high urgency and complexity health system. So we had governors talking and bringing up coalition and a lot of coordination to the scene, especially with the COVID. I hope I did not speak much. Thank you very much. Sorry for.
Not to worry at all. Dr. Chakrabarti, Dr. Steitler, would either of you like to speak to the, and it doesn't have to be solely about the pandemic. We can discuss subnational units as innovators in the context of environment and climate change as well, or in addressing natural disasters or what have you. But if either of you wanted to comment on that, or in the adoption of innovations by subnational units by others.
Generally, the experience is that the subnational units, which are more prone to emergencies, they have an experience with handling the emergencies. They have innovated faster. So there are many subnational governments. They have quickly learned from their emergencies, and they have developed systems for dealing with the emergency situations. And in some of the cases, we find that the subnational government's initiative became a model for the entire country. In the context of India, I can say that we have the provincial governments in Odisha and the Gujarat. Gujarat faced the earthquake in 2001, and Odisha faced a super cyclone in 1999. And in both the disasters, more than 10,000 people lost their lives. And in both the situations, the state governments learned very quickly, and they developed an institutional legal arrangement for managing disasters, which became a model for the whole country. So they innovated in doing this. And there are many subnational governments, we faced emergencies, but they refused to learn from the emergencies. So that is also a situation. In some of the states, we find that, they faced emergencies repeatedly, but their local leadership and then the administrative culture in the states being such that they were not so quick to innovate. They were still lagging behind in the other states. So how the states innovate in a particular emergency situation? Local governments, basically they have to deal with this situation on a day-to-day basis. So that depends on a number of factors. I think the most important factor is the leadership. So leadership at the state level, and also at the leadership of at the sub-national, sub-district, sub-state level. That means at the local level, like the districts or the counties or etc. So there we find that a lot of things depended on how the leadership at the local level, how proactive they were, how sensitive they were to the particular situations. So, and then some of the leaders were, they innovated on different aspects. Some of the leaders, they innovated on the aspect of the technology. Some innovated on involving the communities. Some innovated on, for the gender mainstreaming and so there are so many examples of the good practices and the way that the states innovated in the context of their specific situations, and which became model for not only for that state, but for the country as a whole, and it became a global good practices.
Wow, thank you. Nico, if you would like to comment.
I think there are numerous examples of good practices that were communicated and shared, but one should always place it within the political context in which it took place, because it adds another dimension. Very often, it's your opposition parties governing a subnational government or even a city who wants to show that they are better, or that they can serve their citizens better. So that's real, and that's great competitive politics. now the question is, can the products of this competition jump over political barriers and accepted by the national government, which belongs to a different party? And that in turn depends on what is the political culture in a particular country. In South Africa, it was the Western Cape in opposition hands that did most of the innovation. And there was a real acceptance of their innovations because they were primarily not on policy, but in technology. How do you prepare within a month a field hospital? What is the management? How you do it? Another example was in Spain. There was a ministerial committee eventually on health, and one of the members were the Catalan Minister for Health. And the skepticism was that the Catalans would simply not participate or not say anything, or what they said would not be ignored. And the evidence then showed that the national minister said they make great suggestions. And it took everyone by surprise that, yes, here was an ability for the first time for Catalan's government and the central government to work together. But that depends on your political culture. Then you have in the US, where governors instructed mayors from a different political party not to do, say, social distancing. That there was intolerance of along party lines about how matters should be done. And then it ran through right up to the top to Congress, where you can get legislation passed. So it has a political edge. It should be recognized. And we should know, how do you overcome and actually cooperate? Because this is the key thing about federalism. It is not cooperation when everyone sits in the room belong to the same party, because then this is a centralized system because you rule through the party. It is when you of different political persuasions make decision, and this is where Ronald Watts always said, it's the practice of making compromise joint decisions, which is the strength of federalism. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Professor Steitler. And with that, although during that discussion, I've already come up with a number of other questions, but I think at this point in time, we'll move to the audience Q&A, and Greta has been monitoring your questions. And please, at this point, I would invite any other members of the audience who wish to ask any questions of the panelists. If you would please use the question and answer function here in Zoom, we can move ahead with that. So.
Yes, thank you very much, George. We have three questions so far, and one is two are to Professor Nico Steitler, and one is a general question to all panelists. So I read, Nico, if you allow the two questions, they are addressed to you. So one is from a former winter school participant. He's asking, considering that for efficient coordination to face a crisis, it is necessary not only cooperation between the entities of the federation, but also a coherent direction promoted by the central entity, federal government. Would it be correct to say cooperation and coordination when possible and checks and balances when unavoidable? This is one question, Nico. And the second one would be by Pedro Villarreal, who was a lecturer some days ago at our winter school. In terms of political accountability for the adoption or not of specific public health measures, would local authorities be easier to hold accountable than national authorities who may be far away from adversaries of measures both geographically and politically? If so, could you tell us a bit more about how such accountability has played out during COVID-19? Then we have a third question to all panelists, but maybe Nico, if you want to answer first.
Okay, I think there was another question from Esteban from Chile.
Exactly, but I can read it. Okay, then let's do that. That one is to all, but
okay, it's to all. Then let's do it.
No,
later.
but let's do it. It's okay. Yeah. So Esteban from Chile, he's asking. He's saying, thank you for the wonderful presentations. In many countries, the emergency not only strengthened the national executive, at least temporarily during the first phase, but also the regional state executives. He's collaborating with the constitution building process in Chile. And drawing from comparative lessons, what do you think are the best avenues to further balance the position and powers of the legislative assemblies at the subnational level? If you want to answer also this, Nico,
I think
and
it
maybe
ties also nicely with Pedro's question. On the first one, I would differ that we talk about cooperation and coordination when possible. If you are a federation and believe in the principle of federalism, it's inevitable. It's the must. It's the glue. It's the way in which federations work optimally. And if anything that would come out of this pandemic is the absence of such cooperation has been disastrous. So yes, it is how you collectively address the pandemic. And this also then requires from subnational governments to see the big picture, to see that they are part and parcel of a national response. And usually cooperation and coordination will then result in an effective response. The second two questions was about accountability. Is it easier for subnational governments to hold their executives accountable because they're closer to the people? What we found in the study across of federations in the first initial phase, the first year, is that as the national government was centralized, what we call sort of horizontal centralization, usurpation of the legislatures, the parliament's powers of oversight over lawmaking, it was very effectively usurped. Not usurp is taken out illegally, but often very given through legislative instruments, that the accountability to parliament was weakened. And it was by design. It was the notion that you would want quick action, you don't get parliamentary approval. And at the same time, the same attitude was prevalent at subnational governments. I think of Russia, where by decree, your executives at subnational level were also empowered to make decrees without reference to the legislatures that could have exercised some level of accountability. So it was the same process of horizontal centralization took place at a subnational as well. Which now the question is, what about local government? Local government was one of the areas which probably got the least showtime or time to shine. They were often neglected in the central decision-making where there's coordination. They were not part of the deal between the federal government and the subnational or the state governments. They were often just seen as instruments, as administrations do this, because they played a very important role in executing decisions made by the state governments and the federal government. And it didn't come strongly to the fore that local communities, local councils were more inclined to hold them to account. I think more research needs to be done to see whether there was, in fact, a greater democratization that occurred or continued where there was a centralization, much more executive government at the other two levels of government. Thanks, George.
Thank you very much.
Oh, sorry.
Anna, yeah, Anna or Chakrabarti, do you want to answer as well to the question on Chile and the
they're like
the subnational?
yeah, so the question about Chile was quite interesting, and the political scene in Chile now is a turning point on the historical past of this country. So when we talk about local level in independence, we choose all the way in, so to have local levels with more autonomy and to deal with basic question of day-to-day to the citizens. Usually legislatives at the local level here, they have full power, so they have only like a number of rules they have to comply with, but they have a lot of freedom to run the house and the council as they wish. So like when we look at a federation, it's difficult to detach its legal and its cultural aspects, you know, the way they're shaped, you know, we are a federation like India or in Canada, Australia, India, and the way that they're divided and how the power flows in and out, you know, up and down, has to do with history. So what it comes now to Chile is that they had, as us, they came out of a dictatorship. They were the last country to fall into dictatorship, and one of the last to leave it, and it was quite violent. So going down and layering and having more power on the local level, it seems to be more reasonable. Of course, that the attainability, how they would attain or fulfill this, it would take time and the legislator to be a little bit into a reasonability of the country they want to be and the country they are now. So you have those 2 points. You cannot put like the second point too far away from where you started, but I'm sure that lessons from new federations can be taken, can be used, especially in Latin America, where we deal with this the development quality affecting every single point of our administration, and the political and economic and social, especially social framework in Chile today. So something that's more into self-government would be maybe better socially accepted at the moment, of course. Thank you.
Dr. Chakrabarti, did you wish to speak to any of those points, or?
I think in emergency situation, the executive definitely exercises more authority for dealing with those situations, but it also involves a greater responsibility for responding to these crisis situations. And how better they responded, you know, that is also they are accountable to that extent, not only to the legislature but the people, for the people. So the essential question to be asked is that whether in executive in exercising his authority, it had done so within the framework of the legislative system, or whether the legislative system was functioning through its various methods of checks and balances, like its various committees and other things, where they get a lot of opportunities for questioning the questioning the performance, the authority of the government. So this kind of checks and balances are there in every democratic country. So in the pandemic situation, because of very, very unusual situation, the legislative sessions did not take place as frequently as it should. And sometimes, there are very other activities of the legislature were curtailed to a certain extent. And that made the executive a little less accountable to the legislature. But in the final analysis, they are accountable to the people, and they have to be ultimately the people's court is the final legislature for them. So I think it is not a very correct way to pose the question that whether the executive legislative relationship were disturbed, or more important is that whether they worked in harmony in this kind of situation for dealing with the crisis.
Thank you very much. We have another question on citizen participation. It also to all is a colleague of us who is asking on cooperation and political cultures, competitiveness, political majorities and minorities. To her, an interesting example are citizen councils on the management of COVID-19. And there is also a link to citizen council they did in a German city on COVID-19. Can you think of such similar examples or experiences in other countries? Such practices at local level would, if properly organized, go beyond political competitiveness. Many thanks. Does anybody of you want to answer? Do you know examples of citizen participation in public health? Nico, maybe?
Yeah, well, the ironic one is now there's huge citizens' participation in the revolt against COVID measures and against vaccination, and people taking to the streets and protests. That's citizens saying we are not interested, we are objection. So it is not always, it has many manifestations. And we can just, and it's quite interesting that at first there was not to my knowledge, not many citizens' movements when it dealt with COVID, because everyone was afraid. They was unsure about what it entailed. They had to believe what they were told. And now you have a much more section of the community which are much more bold. They reject science in some degrees, and you see this anti-vax movement, citizen-driven, that gives an example of a type of citizen engagement which may be different from what Elizabeth may have mentioned here.
Mr. Chakrabarty, please, or Anna?
Yes,
Ms. Lorena?
I can tell you from our example from India that we have a very strong, civil society, and they are always very proactively involved in helping the community during crisis situations. During COVID-19, for example, in the second phase, when we had the oxygen crisis in India, where people were not getting admissions, hospitals were overwhelmed with the patients. So it is the civil society organizations, the NGOs, the faith-based organizations, they opened their doors and they performed in an exemplary manner in mobilizing resources at the local level and coming to the help and assistance of these people in distress. So, and presently I am working on a project on strengthening the humanitarian systems. And for that, I'm collecting data. I'm quite amazed to see the extent of the civil society participation. when there was a relative failure of the government for performing their functions which they are supposed to do, for providing healthcare and all. When they failed, then citizens came forward, even in their religious temples and the Sikh gurdwaras also. They converted these temples into temporary kind of emergency, health centers, and providing oxygen support and others. So citizens created a very important role in dealing with the crisis situation. There are some of the states in India where there is a very strong civil society movement for coming to the assistance of the community to supplement the efforts of the government. Thank
Mhm.
Please, yeah.
Okay.
Ms. Lorena, do
Okay.
you want to add?
Yes,
Anna? Yeah.
Sorry.
So Nico just took out words off my mouth. So I think it's pretty much what we see. Civil society has a main role in a number of emergencies. What I thought it was interesting is that the local level opened this ground for discussion. Maybe this would alleviate tensions that we're having in other countries as Australia, Canada, United States, sometimes here. If people could speak out, or maybe here we have the city of São Paulo had a social society council on the pandemic, Rio as well. So it happens that it helps when it comes to an emergency and a response of local levels and the society. You got the local levels, and just down, like, you have the civil society participation. It doesn't matter where, like, the policy goes on a federal, local, or state levels. Like, we had an incident of the federal level trying to delay the vaccination of children, but when the states opened, everyone took the children. So we have, like, a culture of vaccination. So it doesn't matter how it would postpone things, but the adhesion of the society to the vaccine, it was massive. So it is a pretty good proxy to build a public policy in federations, especially. It doesn't matter how many layers you have. You always have to cut it through and see what would work for the population and the society at the end of the day. Thank you.
Thank you, Anna. Then there is another question to all speakers. It's from a winter school participant, and she's asking, which is the role of the armed forces in these crisis management cases in your respective countries? So not only with regard to public health, but also to the migration and natural disasters crisis. Please, Nico, do you want to start?
Fine. I think the armed forces played quite an important role in a number of countries. And the one example is where there's this clear division in a country like, say, in Canada, between the federal government's health functions and the provinces' health functions. In the provinces, they had the hospitals, they had the medical care, the medical services, whilst at the federal level, it was mainly policy. Now, so there are not federal doctors or nurses that could be shifted there. But what they had was the armed forces. And there was then the use of the military medical corps to go to places where there were serious shortages of doctors. Exactly the same happened in South Africa. Provinces are also, they are only provincial hospitals, no national hospitals, except for 4 university hospitals. So again, it was the use of the medical corps of the South African Defence Force that was sent to places, to provinces where there was a shortage or there was acute need. The other use of the military was the enforcement of lockdown regulations, which then obviously they brought power on the streets, they policed, and in South Africa, bad cases where they overstepped their enforcement mark by, in fact, actually causing deaths. So it was a role that and a resource that the federal government had at its disposal, which can be used for a number of on a number of grounds. So yes, a very important element that we saw.
Thank you, Chakrabarti.
Yes, armed forces have been playing very important role in emergency management everywhere. So that's because armed forces, they have their operational readiness, they have their wherewithal, the capacity, the equipments, and the mobility to reach any place, anytime. And they can also perform certain specialized operations in emergency management, like, like maroon search and rescue or collapse structure, or this kind of operation which generally are not there available in the state government agencies and their emergency management system. So in India also, they have been playing important role, and in order to reduce their role, the government set up a specialized force called National Disaster Response Force, which is a 15 battalion strong force deployed in various parts of the country. So the army, the principle is that the army would be the last to move in and the first to move out. That means when other agencies have failed and there are no other alternative, then only armed forces will be called. But when they have done their operation, so they will not stay any longer. So they'll be the first to move out. But we find that since the disasters and the risk of disasters are getting so complex, so the dependence on armed forces have not reduced very significantly. It is still there quite significantly. Thank you.
Thank you. Very interesting. The important role in both crises of the armed force. Anna, please, with regard to the migrant challenge.
Yeah, that's it. I could speak of the migrant challenge. Of course, they coordinate operations of this welcome operation. So they're the COO of this. Of course, the coordination is at Casa Civil at the federal level, and it's a multitasking group with NGOs, international organization, private sector, and everyone involved. But I would like to even bring to light the participation of the armed forces in our federation for everything, or for instance, or first two presidents of the republic were from the military. So it's a big deal here. And today we have much of emergency response, I would say at least 30% of that. Of course, we have civil defense, but we're still relying on the army for a number of challenges, especially on faraway locations involving indigenous people. And during the COVID crisis, there were tents with all military doctors involved. So they have a central role in the logistic. I think it's, from my perspective, it's one of the armies that have more social work that I haven't seen in countries and federations. So they truly have a role, especially because we don't have too much military actions like war actions, or we had not occupied other countries, and usually our armed forces is well known to coordinate activities such as Haiti. We were like United Nations coordination to the government there for a number of years. And in Lebanon and Syria, we were the first head of operations in Lebanon, I think 1951 still. So there's something, it's a national patrimony here. We really stood up for armed forces, as long as it, of course, is on peace times and with institution working correctly. It has a big role to do with us.
Anna, there is a follow-up question on that. Is your civil defense really civilian or retired military officials? Civil defense can be militarized. Thanks for the great discussion.
Okay, today is totally civil. Okay, of course, there are still like old employees that comes from the military. Of course, when I think it's from 88 as well. So since there, we have 100% civil defense. But of course, when you have something of when you need more resources, like more airplanes or something that is a satellites monitoring and things that gets bigger on how much people you need and how much resource. Usually state can draw it or federal can draw it. It depends on the emergency. They can rely to other police or armed forces if it's necessary. Usually to use the resource, it's difficult to have an emergency situation when they're called to how to stop civil unrest. It happens from time to time, but nowadays is not something that we have been facing.
Thank you. So there are no more questions in the chat. I would hand over to George for the last question from his side before we wrap up.
Sorry, I know we're running a little bit longer than anticipated, but I did want to ask sort of a question that's been building up as obviously the importance of coordination and cooperation between the different levels of government has come up time and time again. So I guess speaking broadly across the three different issue areas that we've discussed and across a comparative perspective of different countries, in areas where or in countries where you have seen that cooperation and coordination, I guess, are there trends or causal links to why that cooperation or coordination has come to pass? Is it because they have institutional measures for intergovernmental relations in place previously? Do they already have all these arrangements in place? Or is it better explained by things like, we mentioned the importance of history or political culture, this, that, the other thing. So I guess, speaking broadly, are there any kinds of key trends with regards to why cooperation does or does not happen? And I guess if we could start with Dr. Chakrabarty, if that's all right.
Yeah, cooperation is quite sometimes a political issue. So if you have the same government in power in the federation and also in the provinces, then you find that that we have a good cooperation, because, and what our prime minister says, that in a double engine government, that we have the two governments working together. But we find that sometimes when this is not happening, so these states are not cooperating with each other. So some kind of cooperative framework should be kind of institutionalized in the system. And we find that in India, the system of providing grants to the state government, how much of tax resources which the central government would collect and how much it would be distributed to the states. So we have a very constitutional and very sound constitutional arrangement for the fiscal cycle of 5 years. And that constitutional authority decides that, and which has been a very healthy tradition has been created over the years. So whatever the report of the commission is, the central government accepts it, and the commission formulates its recommendations in a very, very consultative process. So some kind of cooperative cooperation, is built into the process. Now, another area of cooperation which is we find very increasingly taking place, and that is a kind of an analysis based on certain indexes about the performance of the states in different sectors, and linking certain incentives based on those performances. So now these indexes are very scientifically decided, and these are based on the data, on the primary data, and these are evaluated by certain third-party independent agencies, and there are not much of nobody questions those evaluation and all that. So in this kind of framework, we find that there is not only cooperation but kind of competition. Some states, or even at the city level, some cities, trying to outdo each other in terms of performance based on those indexes. So I think this is a very good system for governance. That is the index-based performances and then incentives based on those performances. So that is again another framework, but which we find that kind of cooperation is getting institutionalized in the system. So it is a largely political, but outside the political arena, there are wide areas of cooperation which is substantially non-political in nature, and which is largely getting institutionalized into the system. Thank you.
Thank you. Anna or Nico, did either of you wish to comment on the question? Anybody wish to go first?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, Nico,
okay.
you're on mute.
Okay, let's go. What we found was where there were strong cooperative government systems in place, they just flourished. And it was the established culture that you cooperate. Where there were none in place, and again, sorry to refer to Brazil, but there were none. And so none emerged. One would have thought in a crisis, you would get emergence of it. In some cases in South Africa, there were systems in place. Some were simply put on the back burner or didn't feature strongly in this process of centralization. So the short answer, I would think, is that it is not something that this political coordinations and will to political coordinate just emerged out of an emergency. Sometimes the divisions just became deeper. Political differences became deeper. And it was the sense of, can you unite the country? And the argument in the US is very clear. They said, wasn't it time to have one message to the American people, from the president to it, although the federal government didn't deal with health matters, but the messaging through which is a result of cooperation would have been a huge thing of getting most people on the same page. So the takeaway of that is that cooperation doesn't simply pop out, come out of the woodwork when there's a crisis. You need to build on it, and you need to build on it as the practice, which will then be tested in the fire of a crisis, when you need to act decisively, comprehensively, and quickly. Okay.
Thank you, Nico. Anna, if you would like to offer your comments now.
Okay. So to your question, it would be good to, when you are talking about intergovernmental relations and trends and lessons learned, it came to me like all my memories that when I worked to the federal government, I spent 12 years on federal affairs. So I've worked for 4 different presidents, all with a different view on what a federation, how federative coordination should be done, and how much space or coordination they should have with local levels, how their visions on local levels and their capacities. So it becomes a deep question when we say, well, does intergovernmental relations has a major role into managing crisis, and what the key trends we just or lessons learned from these 3 big challenges of contemporary world, that is health, migration, and environment. So the message is a little bit of what Nico said. Citizens and populations are expecting a straightforward answers from their managers. They live in a federation or a unitary system, but they will always say the government. They don't say, well, the federal government is like doing my life worst, or my mayor is doing my life worst. They say like government make my life worst. So usually, of course, when there's a crisis and there are disputes and different answers for each level, they start to pay attention. They're living in a system that has checks and balance and different spheres of management. So sometimes it is something, it's a trend now. The sport to build the image of each level or each power of a nation. Like the fault is of the mayors, the fault is of the government, the federal government that's not doing good, is the Supreme Court that is delaying the response. So now we bring one more layer of complexity into debates of federations and coordinations talks. So I really that's the trend, that people now holds more knowledge what's going on and how they should deal with each level and who they would poke to solve a question and to see solutions being drawn. Okay, so I think that's it.
All right. Well, thank you all very much. If there were no final points that anybody wished to do, I guess I'll offer up some final remarks and a summary of the proceedings, Greta, if that's all right at this point. So, I mean, obviously this was, as laid out at the very beginning, a very wide-ranging discussion. A couple of key trends that kept coming up throughout this was, one, at the beginning of this, Dr. Chakrabarty highlighted that emergencies across all of these different issue areas are becoming increasingly complex and increasingly interconnected. And of course, this was reflected in all of the discussion points about how the different levels of government all need to interwork, and this need for sort of cooperation and coordination. I think the key part that kept coming up throughout, and Anna, you spoke about it when you spoke about different approaches from different presidents in Brazil that you've worked under, is the role of leadership, which is not necessarily a satisfactory answer in the case of the research question that we were looking to address about whether federal or decentralized systems were better able to address it. But I think it is key in looking at this, in that there are so many more opportunities for leadership at various levels to get things right, and that can, I think, offer some hope for improvements in addressing these emergencies. The key thing is, federal systems are able to innovate and learn from each other, but at the end of the day, it is necessary to have the leadership available to take those steps to willingly learn or coordinate. So I guess there isn't a quick and silver bullet answer for that. So my apologies. I did just want to conclude by thanking once again our three panelists, Professor Nico Steitler, Dr. Dar Chakrabarti, and Ms. Anna Carolina Lorena. Thank you so much for your presentations and offering your wisdom and insights here today. Of course, Greta, thank you so much for giving us the opportunity to put this together, and it's always a pleasure to work with you and URAC more broadly. And I know we have a number of other things on the go at this point in time. And I did want to say thank you to some of the forum support staff that were offering me help in my role in this, specifically from the comms team, John Light and Deanna Senko. And I wanted to give mention of my colleague, Jamie Thomas, who helped me do some background research and prepare for this panel discussion. So, and lastly, thank you, the students and viewers who are watching this. Obviously, this is for your benefit, but without your great questions, this would not have been the success that I personally think it was. So thank you all, and take care, everybody.
Thank you.
Thank you to all.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Goodbye.
Bye.
Bye.